Hi, everyone. Very glad you're able to listen and watch this webinar. My name is Valery Nodem. I work with the Presbyterian Hunger Program on international hunger concerns. In the job that I do, I provide support to international partners around the world working on hunger and organizing as well to create and dream for a better world. And as we do this work as the Hunger Program, something we're hearing a lot from our partners is how much climate change plays a role in their activities and how much it impacts communities around the world. So I just wanted to take a few minutes today and talk about why this conversation matters and why it's really important. But first, what is even climate change? So as we have that conversation, sometimes here in the US, we hear a lot of people at times saying, it's pretty recent that people started talking about climate change. Why should we be really concerned about that? And I think something that is really important to understand is climate change actually refers to the long-term rise in average surface temperatures on Earth. Since the early 20s, when the Industrial Revolution started, scientists around all the world have been measuring the impact of our human activities and how they contribute to warming our planet. And it's also really important as we're talking about climate change to stress on human activities and recognizing that we living on the planet are the ones by our consumption, by our habits, by what we eat, we contribute a lot to, and by the consumption of fossil fuel, such as oil and coal, we contribute a lot to bring more greenhouse gases into the air. A data that I thought was really important to share as well is, since the 1990s, which is 30 years from now, the carbon dioxide emissions have been increased by more than 40% in the world. I thought that was really important and good to share. So to talk about climate change, I thought it was good to talk about how we as PHP see that in the work we do. And we work in three main areas in the world. We believe that to address hunger, or people are hungry because they don't have enough and better food, because there's not enough solidarity with people, and because the environment is actually very polluted as well. So I decided to look at these three lenses and just talk about how we see that through the work that we do around the world. So let's talk about food first. So all around the world, with the high temperatures, with the temperatures rising, farmers are having a harder time now understanding and mastering seasons the way they always did since the world started. When is the right time to plant? When is the right time to harvest? And what are the provisions that they can do to make sure that the crops are not lost? That's actually the biggest challenge that the world is having to produce the food that we need. And let's keep in mind that the world population is increasing. And one of the big concerns now is that if there's not enough food, there won't be enough to sustain and nourish the growing population. In the US, the whole farmers in the Midwest are having a lot of issues because of regular flooding, erosion of their farms. While on the other side, in California, they're seeing a lot of drought and wildfires. We have a colleague from Somalia as well in the call today who is going to talk to us about how they see climate change and mostly drought and flood at the same time in a country like Somalia. That makes it really, really hard for farmers to produce the food that we eat. Water scarcity is being a big problem as well because it's really hard to raise livestock and to produce the crops that we need. When there's a drought, if you need to water your plants, it makes it more expensive and riskier to produce food in such context. And again, the result of that is that food production is really, really becoming harder and harder when we're having a population growing, and food insecurity is growing as well all around the world. And solidarity with people. In the work that we do as the Presbyterian Hunger Program, it's just really heartbreaking, because more than half of our partners globally describe climate change as the largest threat that their countries face, and just all the different phases that climate change is taking. We are partnering with people working on resource extraction, mainly oil, gas, and mining in their own countries, and how significantly these are impacting communities trying to feed themselves. We all know about the deforestation happening in the Amazonia right now, in Central Africa, in islands like Borneo or New Guinea, to build new roads, rail, waterways, industrial agriculture. These are all projects that the world needs or wants, but that comes with a really big price, because communities or the trees that we need to breathe a good air are being threatened by such large investments. We're also partnering with communities that see their countries sell the land that they're using to grow their food organically to huge companies coming from other countries. And these companies, when they come, rather than growing food that would be eaten in those countries, very often grow food that is going to be transported, again, overseas, more fossil fuel that would be burned, either for food here or for biofuel, while other people in their countries are being really hungry. And that's also a big problem. A more livable environment. We believe at PHP, we believe at Presbyterian Church in the US, that the top priority to create a better environment and cool the planet relies on limiting our use of fossil fuels and replace them with renewable and cleaner sources of energy. And we also believe that combining actions both at individual, local, national, international levels all together is really what we need to do, changing our own habits, looking at how our industries are run and subsidized, divest from companies that are investing in fossil fuel, making sure that we support small farmers, because they are really the ones producing for our markets to sustain their families, and making changes in our personal lives that can really help curb the heating of our planet. Next one. So maybe before my next colleague speaks, I think it's really important, coming back to why it matters. Climate change affects all of us in the US, in developing countries, in Europe, in Asia. And in times of coronavirus right now, where we all sitting at home, we are hearing really, really profound stories coming from countries where we're working. For many, many years, activists, churches have been asking to reduce our consumption, reduce how much we rely on fossil fuels, and it sounded like it was impossible. And all of a sudden, the crisis we're in right now has showed us that is actually really possible. We are all at home. It looks like many countries, the planet is really like breathing right now. I was speaking with colleagues in India a couple of days ago who were talking about how, they're able now to see the Himalayas mountains, which we're not able to see because of pollution for decades. Now, all of a sudden, people can see that. Animals are able to walk on streets again, and we are the ones at home. That shows us, the crisis we're in right now shows us that, yes, we have went too far, and it's possible to limit how we affect the world and how we break everything sometimes as human. Climate change, the conversation on climate change matters also because climate change or climate impacts are really, really expensive. If you think about every time there's a disaster, all the relocation that needs to happen, all the assets that people lose after there's a fire, after there's a hurricane, insurance that people need to pay, on their homes now because they're really afraid of when that comes. If you think about all of that, it costs a lot of money. And all of us should be concerned because that money very often is money that we pay through our taxes. Climate change matters as well because it creates a lot of displacement. If you think about the conversation we're having in this country, sometimes about immigration, if we stop for a second and think about why people are leaving, very, very often the story to climate change. When farmers here in the US actually, and in developing countries, when they lose their land and their ability to grow the food that they need, they've lost everything. So most people will have to move and go somewhere else where they can give a better chance to their families. So that is also fueling a huge displacement. And the statistics are talking about hundreds of millions that will be displaced by climate change by 2050. That's huge. Water scarcity is also really, really going bad. Again, Mohammed, coming from a country like Somalia, will probably help us to see how or what that really means in a country like his. And there's a big fear that some countries, some small island nations, could be destroyed if nothing is done due to sea level rise. That's a big concern because I went through that list a couple of days ago and I thought it was just a couple of islands, but there were at least like 40 that were named there. That should really concern us to feel like some countries in the world might be, completely taken off the map in a couple of years. And ultimately, this conversation is really important because we all eat every day. If we don't do anything about climate change, we're going to go and deal with a larger food insecurity and hunger as well, will just be increasing the world. So at the end of the day, it really matters because it's connected to everything that we do and that we use in our life every day. And that's a conversation that I feel like mostly in times like right now, when we're all at home, we need to really see how the planet is finally breathing and taking a break and just needing for all of us maybe to stay home so that we can continue to do its own job.
Thank you, Valery, and greetings to everyone. This is Neddy Astudillo. I'm a Presbyterian pastor here in Florida. And I've been asked to speak about the theological and biblical foundations for climate justice work and disaster. Why should we care? And perhaps I want to focus on more as to how might we or should we respond as people of faith. And I wanted to begin by quoting from a book called Earth Honoring Faith, written by ethicist Larry Rasmussen. In the foreword of his book, Larry elaborates on a passage from Psalm 133, which describes the people of Israel now forced to live in exile, asking themselves how they should now live their faith in a new land, an unknown and hostile land. One where their own culture and their own suffering naturally leads them to doubt that there is any goodness in it, or that even doubt the very presence of God. Even when we today are not living in exile, and I would add, we now understand the reality of a creator God present in all creation and in all nations. This experience of living in a new kind of land, says Rasmussen, where life is threatened by plagues, droughts, floods, storms, does produce in us a similar crisis, not only ecological, but also a crisis of faith, which leads us to ask ourselves, how should we live our days on a planet Earth threatened by climate change and disasters? How should we read the Bible? and sometimes even wonder, how should we also understand God when storms and disaster arise? So let's hear it in more poetic ways as Larry himself writes it in his book. He starts by saying, "The third rock from the sun, that is planet Earth, can no longer be counted on for steady seasons of seed time and harvest, for glacial waters feeding great rivers, for sea levels trustworthy enough to permit the building of great cities, for sufficient time for flora and fauna to adjust to new insects, predators, and diseases, for drought and deluge, for governments capable of marshaling resources to handle disasters of greater number and intensity, or to allay the conflicts that arise when desperate people are rendered helpless and homeless en masse. The third rock from the sun can no longer be counted for rainfall and snowpack, and enough resources to assure that future generations will survive and thrive on their diminished planet. How then do we hymn the earth differently? How do we write and sing a new song for a strange land, even though it be our own?" That ends my quote. This journey of responding as people of faith to the challenges that nature, climate change, and disaster proposes, in a way I was discerning, puts us in an uncomfortable position, at least for those of us who have enjoyed for many years doing environmental ministry, inspired only by the beauty and the goodness of creation. Today we realize that this is not enough, that we also need to respond to the groaning of creation, which includes our brothers and sisters in other lands and in our own land. Earth groaning and laments that, as we see very clearly today with the COVID-19 crisis, are also ours. We suffer when Earth suffers. And to overcome this crisis, some of us will have to make some sacrifices and to make every possible effort to protect lives, even that of those that we feel are far from us. Because on a round planet, sooner or later, we all find ourselves being affected by the other. So in this questioning as a church on how we should live our faith in the time of climate change and disasters, there are two biblical passages that I wanted to lift at before us today. And one is the story of Joseph and the dreams of the Egyptian Pharaoh. I don't know if you remember, so let me briefly remind us of this very particular story, Genesis. Joseph, the son of Jacob, was doubly loved by his father, and that created the envy of his brothers to such an extent that they wanted to kill him, but later decided to sell him as a slave to foreign merchants, who in turn sell him as a slave to the Pharaoh's chief guard. Joseph, for his good character and commitment, wins the favor of the chief guard to the point that he puts Joseph in charge of his own house. But then later, the guard's wife invents a story of betrayal that sends Joseph to jail for several years. The story tells us that God never stops being good to him. And even in prison, he becomes the administrator of the jail cells. While in prison, two servants of the Pharaoh fell prisoner as well. And one night, each of them has a dream, which Joseph interprets correctly and asks one of them in turn to remember him when he's freed, in hopes that Joseph could one day also be set free. But the servant forgets. In this story, we're not told how Joseph learns to interpret dreams, only that he had always been a dreamer, willing to help others, everyone, to understand the meaning of their dreams. And we also know that Joseph was a God-fearing man, a man of faith. 2 more years pass, and now it is the Pharaoh who has two dreams, but none of the wise men nor the magicians of Egypt know how to interpret it. The servant of the Pharaoh now remembers Joseph and tells the Pharaoh about the time when Joseph interpreted his dream correctly. And the Pharaoh then summons Joseph. And with divine wisdom, Joseph interprets his dreams, which meant that Egypt will have 7 years of great abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. The Lord has declared it, says Joseph, and that's why the Pharaoh had the dream more than one time. This is something that no human being will be able to change or to stop from happening. And Joseph explains that that means that during the 7 years of good years, Egypt needs to keep a portion of the grains and administer them in a way that there will be enough for everyone to survive during the bad years. So if we look at the story of Joseph, not just as an ecological phenomenon that somehow, for some reason, produced abundance for 7 years and then famine the other 7. If we look at it, looking to see how Joseph himself and even the Pharaoh responded to a knowledge understood and revealed to them, we see the sensitivity of a people who seek understanding in the knowledge of dreams, in the feelings of the heart, in the experience of faith to prevent human calamity. In this story, we also see that God cannot prevent what was about to happen. It is announced as a fact and as a warning. God does not care to explain why it is happening or if someone is guilty for it. But God is dedicated to inspire dreams, to trouble hearts, to provide spiritual gifts of dream interpretation, and to create a situation where people can prevent unnecessary suffering while the earth provides all that is needed while it can, so for people and animals to survive. We could say that even the earth has a role in this story. In consequence, in the faith of an ecological reality that could not be changed, we see that the glory of the Creator, providential and loving God that we confess, becomes manifest to everyone in the land. Thanks to a community, a multi-faith community, that recognizes each other's gifts and comes together to save lives. In this story, no one seeks their own personal salvation. The Pharaoh cares for his people. Joseph shares his gifts with everyone without discrimination. Farmers continue working the land and give their 10th part to feed the hungry. And the glory of God is manifested because each one in the story does their part. Farmers, healers, scientists, dreamers, producers, and distributors of basic needs, government and community authorities, spiritual leaders, common folk, everyone has a role to play. We see that when this type of caring community forms, when people are good stewards of Earth's gifts, a better world is possible, even in times of crisis. And as a spiritual experience, we may also say that for us, people of faith, when we organize caring communities to respond to the groaning of the earth, we witness the glory of God, God Emmanuel, and the goodness of creation becomes manifested in a way that we also become part of the good news earth has been waiting for. Let me say now one more quick story. This one is quick. Now from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. And this is the story of Jesus and the storm. In Mark, we read that Jesus invites his disciples after a day of intense work to cross the Sea of Galilee, again to an unknown and mysterious land. Possibly the disciples first think, God, how great, finally a time alone with Jesus. Then a tired Jesus falls asleep and a storm begins to brew. Fearful and forgetting that they themselves accepted to follow Jesus wherever he would take, they take them. Whatever he would take them. Jesus, the one who had just equipped them with authority to teach and drive out demons, not a small thing. When the wind begins to rush against the boat, the disciples, instead of at least testing their authority they just received to see if they could stop the wind, they instead panic in fear and shout out to Jesus saying, Jesus, do you not care if we drown? We, the readers of the story, know that, of course, Jesus cares. Jesus is there. And if it was us speaking, that he doesn't want us either to drown in storms provoked by climate change. Like the disciples, he sends us out into the world with his moral and ethical authority. And who knows, maybe even a spiritual powers to stop the storms, to avoid climate change. How? Educating ourselves, changing our lifestyles, speaking truth to power, healing the land, healing God's people, sharing. Just like we see today with the pandemic crisis, God does not want us to drown in worries, but rather to open ourselves to the infinite possibilities that are born when everyone does their part. Some by goodwill, others by faith in a loving God, so that the will of the Father who art in heaven might be done here on Mother Earth as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Neddy, so much. My name is Fete Crews, and I will be sharing a little more about what we mean when we're talking about climate to elaborate on what Valery started earlier. I'm just going to share my screen here. Bear with me. Right. So I just wanted to highlight what beautiful context and grounding Neddy just shared with us. This topic can feel big, and it can feel difficult to comprehend. Not only the science of it, but also how we as individuals can play a part in addressing it. And my favorite biblical passage that I've been really using as a mantra over the last several weeks in the face of this pandemic that we're all experiencing is Psalm 119, verse 105. That your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. And really what rich and inspiring and hope as Neddy just shared that we have at our fingertips to really go back to and say, we have with God, we can do all things. But we are called to a time as this, and it is our responsibility to do what we can now. And that's really all we're being called to do. So let me just go through a little bit of what we need to know. A lot of what I'm going to be covering today, we have partnered with the Presbyterian Church USA and other faith institutions to develop the Moving Forward Guide, a guide to climate action for congregations. So a lot of the material is going to be, that I'll cover today is also in this guide, and you can find it at Blessed Tomorrow's website, blessedtomorrow.org. So when we talk about climate, again, as Valery mentioned, we're talking about primarily an increase in carbon dioxide levels, which are contributing to the warming of this planet. And this graph, I think visuals are often helpful. This graph shows us that really looking back over 800,000 years, we can see that as carbon dioxide has increased in our atmosphere over time, correlated temperature has risen. And if you look at the far right of this graph, you can see what Valery was mentioning earlier, that the carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere are exponentially greater than they've truly ever been in most of recorded history. So this is what our concern is. This is why we're concerned that the temperature will ultimately correlate with this rise and prevent us from really living the lives that we live today. And I think a picture, or rather a video here, speaks 1,000 words. So I just want to show this. This is from NASA and shows the rising temperature over the last 100+ years. So again, I always think visuals, some people are visual learners, and that's a very helpful way to talk about what we're talking about, to see what we're talking about, I should say. And again, as Valery mentioned, we know that there are human causes that are driving those increase in carbon dioxide that you saw in that graph earlier. So in the US, these are US statistics. Globally, it looks a little bit different, but in the US, transportation is our #1 contributor, followed by industry, electricity production, commercial and residential buildings, and then agriculture as well. So when we talk about what is driving disasters, the increase of weather disasters with climate change. The climate change, people will say, oh, well, it's sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's warm, you know, how is that really different? What we're seeing is that climate change is increasing the frequency and the intensity of weather-related disasters. So sure, we might remember a blizzard from the 1970s. How is that different from what's happening today? It's the frequency and the intensity of these events that are different and that are driving the really significant concern that scientists and groups like us are trying to do something about at this point. And I'm just using the US, the continental US here as an example, but again, we know that climate change is happening today, the impacts are happening today, but they're happening to people differently depending on where you live. So if you're in New England, you might be experiencing more extreme weather, rising sea levels, but if you're in the Southeast, you may be having actually heavier rain. If you're in the Southwest, you're having more droughts. With the area of California, obviously we're seeing increased wildfires. If you're in islands or island nations, you know, really looking at all of these things impacting the ability to just continue to operate as we would normally on a day-to-day basis. And when we talk about this, you know, I think this graph also helps to show what I'm talking about here, in that if you look over the last, 40 years or so, $1 billion, and this is adjusted for inflation, $1 billion weather events, we're skewing to the right here on this curve. We're seeing them happen more and more often. And in fact, the last 4 or 5 years have seen the greatest number of $1 billion disasters on record. And so Valery mentioned this. I'm not going to go through this too much in depth, but I think it's really helpful to also understand, okay, so we understand now what's happening. Carbon dioxide's going up. We're seeing the planet warm. That's actually causing wide variations in the intensity and frequency of weather-related disasters. And now we can talk about how is that impacting ministry priority areas that your congregation, the Presbyterian Church is already working in, caring about, investing time, resources, and our God-given talents to try to address. So again, if you care about water, access to clean water, climate change, you care about climate change. So we're seeing extreme heat leading to increased droughts, but depending on where you live, this might actually be increased flooding because you're seeing increased rain events. And we're seeing, waterborne illnesses increase over time. If you care about hunger, you care about climate change. Valery noted many of these points earlier, but this is real. It's happening now. It's happening today, and not only in the US, but in other parts of the world. If you care about migration issues, you care about climate change. And Valery talked a little bit about this as well. If you care about peace, conflict, and justice issues, you care about climate change. As we see those migratory patterns that Valery mentioned, we also know that can increase conflict and competition for scarce resources. If you care about health and access to health care, public health issues, you care about climate change. Whether we're talking about the rise of animal and insect-borne diseases in places that they didn't exist previously, or you're talking about the profound mental health impacts of climate change on communities who are experiencing these disasters and increased issues over time. If we're talking about increased flooding that's making it difficult to build and sustain existing infrastructure. And if you care about addressing the inequities that we already know exist in the world, you care about climate change because it's going to exacerbate those existing inequities, particularly for communities of color, for low-income communities, and when we talk about our vulnerable populations like elderly and children. So I mentioned poverty. Resiliency and the ability to survive circumstances like this depends on income. We're seeing it with the COVID-19 pandemic, that people who have an extra, spare money in their bank accounts can survive loss of a job or, change in working hours. We're seeing it play out right now, and this is what we might continue to see as climate change worsens over time. when we talk about environmental racism, these are just some statistics that exist today already. So you can imagine that as climate change increases the risk of respiratory illness, et cetera, that communities of color, particularly African Americans and Latinos, are going to be more at risk for disease. And I mentioned, our elderly and our youth. We are the people today, as I mentioned earlier, we are called to a time as this, and we are the ones who are able to make the change. We are the ones who are able to advocate for the policies that we need in order to make these changes. But our young people, I have a 3.5-month-old daughter and a 14-year-old daughter. They are the ones who are going to bear the brunt of these climate impacts that we're talking about. Valery mentioned by 2050 is really when we're expecting to see some of those worst case scenarios begin to play out. And that's when my children are going to be coming into their prime. So it is our responsibility to do what we can. And when I get to a later part of this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about what we can do. But I want to turn it over now to Edwin to talk about what he's experienced in his work. So Edwin, I'll stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Annie. Hi, everyone. My name is Edwin Gonzalez. I'm an associate for disaster response for Presbyterian Disaster Assistance in Latin America and the Caribbean. I am originally from Puerto Rico, and right now I live in Louisville because of my job, but most of my life I lived in the island of Puerto Rico, and actually was there during Hurricane Maria, one of the worst hurricanes that has affected the island of Puerto Rico. I want to share a little bit about what we do in Presbyterian Disaster Assistance. We basically provide assistance to organizations and to partners around the world and in the United States, churches and presbyteries that work on responding to major disasters, and either natural disasters or human-made disasters. And we connect with partners, and we try to provide resources, trainings, and different materials and preparedness for them to be ready, and to also how to deal with disasters like a hurricane and many others. I started my job because I lived in Puerto Rico, and I was working in the response to Hurricane Maria when it happened. Many of you have heard about what happened in that time, and in my case and my wife, we sadly got to experience it firsthand. In 2017, many strong hurricanes affected the Caribbean and different parts of the United States and the south of the United States. In Puerto Rico, Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria were the worst that affected. And for many people, sometimes the conversation is that we always had hurricanes. That is something that has always happened. But there's actually a research and an article from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science of the United States of America that mentions that estimates that as the Earth gets warm, the probability of storms and precipitation level like Hurricane Harvey, for example, was higher in Texas in 2017 than it has at the end of the 20th century. And because of climate change, storms like those evolved from once in 100 years to events that happen every 16 years. Another study from the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change mentions that although the amount of hurricanes are not going to increase, probably the intensity of those hurricanes activities in North Atlantic since the 1970s has increased. In the future, there may not necessarily be more hurricanes, that means, but they're going to be stronger. And we have been seeing it for the past few years, especially the people who live in the Caribbean. On September 20th, 2017 at 6:15 a.m., we were hit in Puerto Rico with Category 4 hurricane. and the wind miles of that hurricane was around 155 miles. But in some places in Puerto Rico, it registered almost 200 miles per hour. The flood waters were waist high, with more than 30 inches deep, and often with sewage ridden. Many of the rivers in Puerto Rico overflowed and caused flooding in nearly all the 78 municipalities of the island, causing, of course, terror and devastation everywhere. Like I mentioned, the winds and the wind gusts were over 200 miles in some places, destroying trees, traffic lights, towers of light, removed roofs, and the sound that the wind made blowing through trees and blowing through structures was like a monster was coming and hitting the island of Puerto Rico. The amount of damage caused by Hurricane Maria in the island was extreme. The amount of crisis that it left in the people and still is on the people in Puerto Rico who years after continue to face this situation. It's just overwhelming. As you see on the picture, Hurricane Maria hit almost the entire island of Puerto Rico, and because of the size of the hurricane, it covered the whole island, and made great damage on the infrastructures. One of the issues that we faced, and it was, I think, what the most difficult, was that the whole island was in dark. We lost complete power, electrical power in the whole island. 60% of the population of the island. We're talking about 3.4 million people, and 60% of those people were left without drinking water. From all the 78 municipalities, were left without communications. 92.7 of the telecommunications towers were down because of the hurricane. There was no TV, no radio, hardly any internet anywhere on the island. There was a study, according to the New England Journal of Medicine, that mentioned that in some places, households went 84 days without power. Now imagine in your case, you're left a few hours without power, you go into a crisis, or a few days into 1 or 2 days, and you're calling every minute the power authority. Imagine spending 84 days without refrigeration, without, in some cases, without medicines that you needed to be refrigerated, and many other of the commodities that having electricity brings. And that same study that reveals that in some households, they spent 68 days without water. 68 days. And in some cases, 41 days either without cell service in their areas. So the amount of the effect of this Hurricane Maria in the children, in the elderly, in the people who are bedridden, who have health conditions, was even worse than most of the people in Puerto Rico. And the situation was seen everywhere, different from other hurricanes that we had experienced before. For example, Hurricane Hugo hit the north part of Puerto Rico, so a lot of the areas in the south and other places were able to provide help and were not that damaged compared to the metropolitan area or the northeast area. But in this case, it was the whole island who was completely destroyed. There was not a place that you could go in Puerto Rico where you couldn't find some type of destruction, houses affected. According to the Department of Natural and Environmental Resources, and this is a huge number, 98% of the adult trees broke or were crushed or obstructed the routes and roads in Puerto Rico. 98%. one of the other damages, and it's sad because when we talk about climate change, we think about options that we have to make changes and to make uh, fix what is happening. And we talk about solar farms and windmills. Sadly, because of Hurricane Maria, one of our biggest solar farms in Puerto Rico was completely destroyed. And the 13 windmills that were installed in 2012 in Puerto Rico also were completely destroyed. Most of the hospitals in the island were left without electricity and were damaged. The next day after Hurricane Maria, only 7 of the hospitals in Puerto Rico were running thanks to generators. Areas were completely flooded, either because of the rain or the water or the ocean or the waves, or because dams broke or the government had to open them because they were overflowing and they were almost breaking, which put a lot of people in difficult situations. In the town of Tuabaja, for example, the authorities had to rescue over 2,000 people that live in an area that was flooding because of a dam in that area. And of course, one of the other issues that you have with hurricanes as big or as strong as this or any other hurricanes is the effect that it has on the plantation and the crops and on the land, which in the case of Puerto Rico, and it's interesting because 80% of what we have in Puerto Rico, of what is eaten in Puerto Rico, comes from the outside. But that 20% that was that is grown in the island was completely destroyed. The harvest of coffee and banana was completely lost because of Hurricane Maria. The losses in economical amounts reached almost $740 million just in the crops and the fields. The airport was destroyed, flights were restricted, and because being an island surrounded by water, lots of water, we had a big issue is because we depend on everything being brought from outside, either by planes or by boats. And because the ports were damaged and the airport was damaged, there was a lot of problems on receiving most of the things that we needed to respond to the emergency and to what was happening. In the case of the airports, some flights were restricted for 11 days. So for people to leave or to come, it was a major issue. It has this hurricane has been compared to a hurricane that hit in 1932 called the San Ciprian, and the amount of disaster in this case was greater than that one, and that was the strongest hurricane that had hit Puerto Rico before. The amount of damage in households, for example, an estimate of 472,000 households suffered some level of damage in the island. And between 25,000 and 30,000 houses were completely destroyed. This, and similar to one Anne mentioned before, most of the damage, it happens to the people who are poor. People who have financial resources are able to leave their areas, to leave their houses, to find new places, or to just leave for a few months, or buy a big generator that will provide electricity for all day. But the poor communities, those who are more vulnerable, the people who do not have access to food security, the people who do not have provisions or have health care, those are the people who are more in risk because of situations like a hurricane. Those are when you fly to Puerto Rico weeks or months after Maria, you could see a lot of the houses in the San Juan area, which is the capital of Puerto Rico. Most of the houses were in the poor communities were the ones who had tarps on their roofs, and you could notice the difference between communities. The area, the tourist area of Condado and San Juan, of course, because the economical needs were the first who were fixed and repair, but the other areas, the poorest areas in San Juan, were left. Even today, there are still needs in those areas. So the situation when we talk about climate change, and there's a book from uh, an author called "The Cry of the People, the Cry of the Earth," and he mentions that when we talk about the effects of climate change and we talk about the effects of pollution, we're talking about the effects of the poor people and the people who cannot make change of the situation, the people who are probably not the ones who are doing the damage and are contributing to the damage, but are being affected by the damage. And we see that everywhere. We see that in Latin America, in many places. We see that in Oroya, in Peru, where you have communities that were affected by mining companies that came and did work there and destroyed the land and just left, and they didn't do anything to repair what they did. But the poor people in the communities are the ones who have to face the challenges and have to survive and spend whatever they have to try to fix their lands and recover what they once had. And this, the sadness is that this continues to happen, and the reality is that as the year passes, what we are seeing is worse and worse hurricanes affecting the island. In my case, after Hurricane Maria, I thought I wouldn't see something as bad as Hurricane Maria again. I was hoping and I was praying, but the reality is that just 2 years after, a year after, in 2019, 2 years after, sorry, in 2019, Hurricane Dorian happened, and thank God it didn't hit Puerto Rico. I was actually there that week that it was coming. It didn't hit Puerto Rico, but our brothers and sisters in the Bahamas were completely affected by this hurricane, and the amount of destruction was unprecedented, and the amount of challenges that the people in the Bahamas are still facing to this day are something that seems impossible to fix. The amount of destruction, and again, when you talk to the people, when you talk to the communities, and you discover a lot of houses in Bahamas were owned by wealthy people that even didn't live there. It was the poor people, a lot of immigrants, Haitians, communities who live in Abaco Island, either died because of this hurricane or disappear, or were had to move from their houses, or their houses were completely destroyed. So our worriness or nightmares right now is that as years continue, every hurricane season, this is going to get worse. And right now, with this situation of the coronavirus happening, the question in many minds is that we're less than a month from the hurricane season starting again, a month and a half, and how are we going to respond? How the people in Puerto Rico and the small islands are going to be prepared for a major disaster like this, while also facing issues like coronavirus, or in the south of Puerto Rico, the earthquakes. So there are major questions and concerns that we have when talking about climate change and the effects on Latin America and the Caribbean and other places in the world that suffer the consequences of decisions that are, in some cases, are not in their hands. That is my time for now, and I'm glad to be able to talk to you a little bit about the situation that we're facing and the ways that we have affected our communities and our towns. So I think Mohammed is next, and I will leave so he can appear on the screen. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you very much for the Zoom meeting. My name is Mohammed Ahmed Aden. I am the Executive Director of Calmo Relief and Development. Calmo is a local organization based in South Central Somalia. Our work is mainly focused on relief and development. So we mainly work on providing short-term emergency relief to crisis-affected communities in Somalia, while also providing long-term support for the same communities. And regarding the climate change and disaster topic, I think Somalia is one of the worst countries affected by climate change in terms of drought, seasonal flooding, and locust infestation. Talking about the issue of drought, I think Somalia has seen several successive droughts in the past. The worst one being the latest one, which affected Somalia, was in 2017. And the previous drought which affected Somalia was in the year when the United Nations declared a famine in Somalia due to the intensity and the donors very intensive in Somalia. Say that drought becoming an issue in Somalia, which is more related to climate change in Somalia, because most of the Somali communities are rural communities. They depend on livestock and agricultural production. While the two systems, livelihood systems, interrelated, they are also affected by climate change. The issue of water crisis is becoming an issue right now because the livelihoods of the pastoralist communities is dependent on lights. So water availability is also an issue. In drought is becoming very frequent in the past 10 years. And for example, in the last 10 years, we have seen 2 droughts occurring, one in every 5 years. In 2011, we have seen the worst ever drought in 60 years. And in 2017, we have also seen another drought. So you see that it's becoming more frequent than ever before, with the climate change now becoming the major cause for the repeated droughts. The climate change is also affecting farmers, particularly the subsistence farmers who produce crops to feed their families. And with the collapse of the federal government in Somalia in 1991, there was no support for the farmers, particularly in terms of extension support, so that they can start growing throughout the season. International aid agencies have been on the ground since 1982, when the Somali government collapsed, providing support to the farmers, but the support was not enough to feed the growing population of Somalia. Right now, we are having a local infestation crisis, which is affecting the farmers in Somalia. It's also affecting neighboring countries like Kenya, wiping out crops, making the farmers vulnerable to climatic conditions. The locust infestation report has been shared with Valery Nodem, which was released by FAO Somalia food. In fact, looking at the issue of drought, in fact, it is the biggest challenge we have right now in Somalia, and that is affecting almost everybody, even the urban communities, because their livelihoods is also dependent on the rural communities, the livestock keepers, the livestock products, and the farmers. Water is also, like I said before, is also an issue in Somalia, because most of the water sources in Somalia are subsurface water sources, and mostly they are not permanent. Somali people only get water during the rainy season, and water is stored in dams, in earth dams, in shallow wells, and they only last for 3 to 2 months after the rainy season. This exposes great risk for the people, because they don't get enough water, particularly clean water is also a challenge, as there is no constant supply of water. I think the case is different now, because with the lack of support by the government, which is only focused on the capital city, Mogadishu, and did not still spread to other parts of the country due to armed conflict with the extremists and other armed groups. This is making it difficult for the government to provide services to its people. And the only actors in the field who are providing support are the international aid agencies and the local organizations like Calmo, who are providing critical support to provide access to sustained water supply, livelihood, and agricultural products. As right now, as we speak, we are going to the rainy season, and the issue of the outbreak of COVID-19 is affecting Somalia, where we have 8 death cases and a total of 150 cases confirmed. This is also exacerbating the situation, the humanitarian situation, which was already fragile, and making it difficult for people to go outside, get water. There is no piped water in the homes, and people mainly go outside to collect water from the communal sources. The issue of also hygiene, particularly in the IDP communities who are already displaced by drought and conflict, thereby making the situation more worse in the coming 2 to 3 months if the outbreak of the COVID-19 continues. I hope that the issue of climate change is now a good topic for discussion when it comes to Somalia, because it is particularly related to the context of Somalia, where we have also the seasonal flooding, which affects in every rainy season. We normally experience floods along the river beds, because when the rainy season starts, people are displaced from the areas near the river and the riverbeds, because obviously there will be flooding as the rainy season comes. So people will lose crops, they will lose property and everything. So to resolve the flooding issue, there will be need for construction of flood systems, like construction of gabions, construction of flood water, where when the flood water are gone, we start cultivating the crops. But it's also destroying crops which were cultivated by farmers along the river, and it makes difficult for the farmers to harvest during the harvest season. the aid agencies are doing what they can to make sure that they do flood control systems, but the issue is now focused on COVID-19 response and also the locust infestation. In general, frankly speaking, we have a situation now in Somalia where most of the programs are tailored towards emergency response, and there is less focus on developmental issues, developmental programs that has a long-term focus on developing water systems, building resilience of community. That is mainly due to lack of funding by the UN agencies and also in international aid organizations due to the shrinking space of the funding space in Somalia. That's why we normally send a lot of drought appeals, flood appeals to aid agencies, and we normally end up in getting no funding or little funding. So the best thing would be to for us to start climate resilient farming in Somalia, so that we can resist the climate change effects in Somalia. For example, introduction of drought-resistant crops, that can stand with the rain, with the drought season, and that can benefit the farmers. We also need to provide support to the farmers through extension support, training, and capacity building. In Somalia, farmers are receptive to new technologies, new ideas, because they want to start and develop their farming systems. Resilient agricultural livelihood systems is also important through strengthening of integrated crop livestock farming systems, and also water and land ecosystems. So if we combine the three issues of crop improvement, resilient agricultural livelihood systems, water and land ecosystems, those three areas integrated would most likely benefit the farmers and the pastoralists in Somalia, who will be able to cope and withstand the climate change effects in Somalia. Over to you now, Valery and Jessica.
Great, thanks so much to Mohammed and Edwin for sharing those really incredibly powerful stories about the experiences in both Puerto Rico and in Somalia. And I am going to share my screen once again for everyone. What I wanted to do was to particularly talk about solutions. The call to action that we just heard from Mohammed about funding, about coordinated response, about particular ways that we might be able to support from a policy perspective, efforts to help assist what's going on in the ground there are heard loud and clear. So Blessed Tomorrow is an organization that's embedded within another organization called Eco America, and Eco America does a lot of public messaging and public awareness research. I wanted to just quickly share some statistics with you before I dive into, so what is it that we as people of faith can be doing? This is a lot of information. It's profound. It may feel heavy. It may feel impossible, and it's not. There are things that we can be doing, especially those of us in places of privilege where we have the resources, the time to invest in these solutions. So I just wanted to share some of our recent research, again, in Eco America, really tells us that it's not just me telling you this. We are hearing from Americans. This is a statistically significant survey that Americans are aware of what's happening, the increase in intensity and frequency of these extreme weather events. They're aware of it. They're personally concerned about it. And at 3/4 of Americans reporting that they're personally concerned about this. And even when we break it apart from political perspective, which we know often influences the way people perceive what's going on in the world, it's still pretty significant. We're talking about over half of Republicans reporting that they're concerned, 2/3 of independents, and most Democrats who are responding in this way. But there's a big gap here that I want to talk about, which is when we ask those same people, do you think others are concerned? They're responding that they believe other people are concerned at a much less rate than they are themselves. And this is an interesting gap I'm going to talk about in just a moment. And to what we've all been talking about this entire time is that even, again, this is based in the US, but we know that those who are in often marginalized communities are experiencing these increased frequency and intensity of weather-related events at a much higher rate. When we ask about record heat waves, African Americans, Latinos, women, those living in urban settings are experiencing those at greater rates. The same goes for reporting that they're experiencing harm from extreme weather, reporting that they're experiencing more severe droughts, reporting that they're experiencing increased breathing problems. Back to that slide I showed earlier about the impacts of respiratory illness. But here we go. So this is this 57% you saw on the previous slide was from our data 2 years ago. We're not completely done with that, so I couldn't incorporate it all together. But this is the latest and greatest data that we have from just last year, from our survey in 2019. And again, so we have 74% of Americans responding that they are personally concerned, but they only believe that 59% believe that others are concerned at the same rate. So we have a gap here. And what we believe is that because people don't think other people are concerned, they don't want to talk about it. They feel concerned about raising it as an issue among others, and they may not be as motivated to take action. And so we as people of faith have a really important role to play. We can be talking about this with other people. We can use some of those really incredible biblical passages and stories that Neddy shared earlier to connect with other people in our congregations, in our faith communities, friends and family. And we can talk about what's happening. We've just shared a lot of information. We can tell stories, whether it's our own personal stories or examples shared by Edwin and Mohammed. And we can work to address our own carbon footprints by reducing our energy use, moving towards things like clean energy sources. We can think about how we prepare and become more resilient, as Mohammed was talking about. And we can certainly think about how we bear witness to our policymakers about this and encourage them to take action themselves. So I'm just quickly going to walk through some of that in the context of disaster response. So we talk about what is it that we can do as people of faith. And one of the things I think a helpful framing for us to think about this is how can we as people of faith, as congregations, as communities of worship, create refuge in the face of climate change. So not only can we work to try to prevent those worst case scenarios that we've talked about by reducing our energy use, we can also think about how we can serve our communities as they experience the climate change impacts that are happening now and that we unfortunately know will get worse before they get better if we take the action that we know is needed. And we are used to this as faith communities to some degree when we think about disaster response. You know, if you think about who is on the ground, sometimes the first people on the ground after a disaster, it's people of faith. It's our Presbyterian disaster assistance and other agencies like it. So again, frequency and intensity, can't say it enough. I think that's a very helpful way to talk to others about this as well. So what happens? We have a climate event, we have a disaster. We can respond by following the protocols and plans that we may have put in place for a disaster. And if we don't have that, we can create one and establish one. We can think about serving those most urgent needs first. I think the COVID pandemic right now is providing, as Edwin mentioned, this incredible example of response that we know we can mirror with climate change if we have the will to do it. And we're already doing this, but we can serve as temporary housing, temporary medical centers, reunification centers, supply distributors. This is stuff we're already doing, but we could do it in the context of climate change as well. And then we go into the longer term relief. This is typically thinking about lasting days to months. After those immediate threats have been addressed, the relief really can begin. This is where we can think about those non-emergency projects like debris cleanup, food distribution, those extended temporary housing. But this is the immediate aftermath, right? So I think what we're really talking about is how can we become better prepared as communities, as congregations, and I want to talk about not only what we can do together, but what we can do personally. So when we think about that longer term recovery, obviously, as I mentioned before, in some of the images of the impacts in different regions of just even looking at the continental US, that's something we need to take into consideration, right? So what can we expect to continue to happen? As both Edwin and Mohammed mentioned, it's the intensity of these storms, it's the frequency that's increasing, and so we need to maybe revisit the way that we're implementing policies, the way that we're rebuilding, to do so in a way that allows us to be better prepared for the next time. And I think one of the most important things to think about is when we talk, and I'll talk in a minute, about creation stewardship, so ways that we can reduce our own carbon footprint and be better stewards of God's creation, it actually helps us to become more resilient down the road. One of the things in the Moving Forward guide that I mentioned at the beginning of my first talk, and again, I'm showing it here on the screen for you, we provide a roadmap to think about how you can actually, as an individual, but even as a congregation, to think about reducing your energy use. Primarily focusing on energy use because, as I mentioned earlier, it is one of the largest drivers of carbon dioxide increases. And things you can think about, where are you now? How much energy are you using now, whether it's at your home or at your place of worship? Get a baseline understanding of that. And then look at ways that you might conserve energy. So whether it's new habits like installing programmable thermostats, lights that turn off when people leave the room, even just moving to LED lights can really increase or decrease the amount of energy that you're using, potentially up to 30% of a difference. This is not insubstantial. And then maybe over time, you start to see savings from some of these activities, and you can think about investing those savings into improvements. So whether it's insulating your walls, if your congregation's HVAC system goes out and you need to replace it, consider replacing it with a high energy system that's going to, over time, save you more money. And after you've done these for a few years, you continue to see savings. There might be ways that you can invest further. Things like installing solar or considering buying renewable energy if it's offered in your area. I live in Vienna, Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., and our power provider allows us to purchase clean energy as an option. And so both at home and in my congregation, we've opted to do that. So it's something you can do anytime. You don't have to necessarily do it in this linear order. Some people like a roadmap, so that's why we present it this way. And then finally, we know that we're never going to be able to completely reduce our carbon footprint, our energy use in particular. You might have to take that train or plane ride or drive to work. There are things that we're just not going to be able to stop doing for real and meaningful reasons. And if you have the means, again, this is what I mean about being in a position of privilege, if you have the means to consider offsetting your carbon usage, that's something to think about. So this is where you're helping to reduce other people's carbon usage, carbon emissions, because you yourself are not able to, therefore offsetting it. So things like encouraging the planting of trees in your own community or in other parts of the world. Blessed Tomorrow offers a carbon offset program that you might think about considering, and you can find more information on our website about that. And I think one of the most important things is really thinking about how we can encourage, as we're thinking about becoming more resilient as communities, after climate events, after weather disasters, is to think about how we can encourage the adoption of policies that are going to address these inequities that both Edwin and Mohammed and Valery spoke about. I think Neddy spoke about as well. This is something that we're seeing even now with the COVID-19 stimulus response. There are, trillions of dollars are going to be flowing into our economy here. How can we make sure that that those funds are being used in ways that encourage energy efficiency, that encourage the use of and transition to clean energy sources, that address some of the existing inequities in terms of people's ability to withstand disasters when they strike. These are things that we as people of faith can lift up our voices. We can bear witness to this, and that's one of the things I want to talk about next. So I'll skip through this a little bit quickly just for the sake of time. Here is a list of resources I encourage you to consider connecting with, particularly the PCUSA's Sustainable Living and Earth Care Ministries. If you go to pcusa.org/climate, a lot of the information that's being shared today can be found there. Neddy's organization, GreenFaith, has a really wonderful tool called Living the Change that allows you as an individual to go in and actually consider what ways you might particularly be able to reduce your carbon footprint, whether it's reducing your energy use, as I discussed, or things like considering, the way that you eat or other behaviors you have throughout your day. So let me get to this messaging point because this is so important. This is so important. You, whether you're clergy, a lay leader, a congregant, you are a faith leader. I am deeming you a faith leader right now. You can lead. You can lead in your home, in your community, in your congregation. And we know at Eco America through our own research that people of faith, and particularly clergy, are consistently identified as trusted messengers and seen as people who cut through the partisan divide. Right, so your faith tradition at Presbyterian Church USA, particularly the Office of Public Witness, is supporting efforts for public engagement, messaging on this issue, and advocacy. And with a plan, you can do anything. You really can. So I want to talk to you about the spectrum of engagement and advocacy, and maybe you see yourself in one of these points, like the roadmap. This does not necessarily indicate a linear progression, although it may feel that way for some. But some of you on this in this webinar are ready to, go meet with your congressperson and talk about this issue from your perspective as a Presbyterian. Some of you are just getting familiar with this, and you're not quite ready to do that, right? So you might fall on some part of the spectrum. But these are the things you can think about doing. Become climate literate. The webinar is a great example of that. Start to understand how this is impacting the world, how it's impacting you, your community, the way that your faith is calling you into action on this issue, as Neddy described, and understand, the ways that you can engage, the ways that you can act. So you're doing that today. And then start to relate climate to faith and talk about it with other people of faith, using some of those tools and knowledge that you've gained. And then think about how can you, as a person of faith, raise that voice in your community? Are there ways that you can speak with policymakers at a local level, bring others from different congregations, different faith traditions together to talk about this issue and plan? There are great examples of this happening all over the church and around the country. The organization Presbyterians for Earth Care is a great resource with examples that different congregations are leading in this area. And then take your voice national. Think about ways that you can spread this information and really call on policymakers to take action. You are their constituent. They care about what you think. And again, we know from our own research that as people of faith, you can often cut through the partisan divide that sometimes makes this conversation difficult. I want to share some resources because I know just talking about that is not enough. Again, the Office of Public Witness is a really great resource. You have wonderful people in Washington, D.C. Working on ways to get involved at the federal level. So make sure that you're connected with them, that you visit their website, that you subscribe to their information and social media if that's your thing. If you have any concerns about getting involved from an advocacy perspective, you can. It's not illegal. And if you have concerns about that, you can review the IRS tax guide for religious organizations. Talking about this issue and encouraging action is permitted. And then we have another guide besides the Moving Forward guide at Blessed Tomorrow called Let's Talk Faith and Climate that helps you have some language, some examples of sermons, other messaging bits and baubles that you can use to think about how you can communicate this in your own home or your community or your congregation. I mentioned GreenFaith. There's also an organization called Creation Justice Ministries that the Presbyterian Church belongs to. It used to be the Environmental Ministries organization based within the National Council of Churches and is now its own separate organization, but they do a lot of federal advocacy on this issue and other environmental issues. They also produce a really incredible resource every Earth Day. This year's topic is called The Fierce Urgency of Now, and it talks about and provides sample sermons and Bible study tools and resources and all kinds of a whole toolkit, a packet of information that you can use about how to talk about the fierce urgency of now with this issue in particular and why people of faith should get involved. Perfectly aligned with what I just covered here. And then some of you may be familiar with an organization called Interfaith Power and Light. This is a grassroots organization that works on environmental issues, particularly climate change. They have chapters in 40 states around the country and maybe local to you. And so they'll have a much more local context for what's going on in different ways that you can get engaged on this issue in your community.